Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's morning ramble. And for those of you who don't know, in 2008, I had a sort of a life-changing insight. And what I saw in a nutshell was that I wasn't a depressed person. I just thought that I was. And if that makes no sense, don't worry about it. I'm sure as we talk, and if you go back and read my books or watch the TED Talks, hopefully that will make sense to you and not seem dismissive or shallow. But it made me re-examine everything that I had been learning and teaching up until this point. And by that point, I'd already had a couple of books out. And my books after that, the 4 books I've written since that experience, they're very different. They're very different in tone because they come from a different understanding of how the mind works and who and what we are. And I went back recently and I reread my first book from Hay House, You Can Have What You Want. And that was me. And to my kind of pleasant surprise, there was still a lot of things in there that I could get behind and that I could kind of go, okay, it doesn't look quite like that to me now, but I wasn't completely off base. One of my favorite things when I went back through the book, though, was a quote at the very front of the book. And it's a quote from one of my favorite playwrights, George Bernard Shaw. And in fairness, he's not necessarily one of my favorite playwrights. His plays can be a little bit wordy, but he's my favorite quotable person. Like, he just had so many great quotes. And this is a quote that, even though I obviously thought it significant enough to put it at the very front of the book, I don't remember it at all. And here's what it says. I'm not a teacher, only a fellow traveler of who you asked the way. I pointed ahead of myself as well as you. And that's what really struck me this morning when I was thinking about what to ramble about, is I forget that from time to time. I think that in order to be allowed to talk about anything, I have to be the world's leading expert on it. In order for it to be legitimate for me to share what something looks like with people, I have to absolutely know what it is. And while I'm not advocating talking shit for its own sake or pretending you know things, well, here's what I think about nothing, I am pointing to the fact that with a lot of sincerity, it's really valuable to share what you see and what you've seen along the way that's been of genuine help to you. And that was the Scottish mystic Sid Banks, one of the conversations that I've heard about him with George Pransky, who was my mentor. And George was a successful psychologist and teacher when he went up to see Sid for the first time, and he met with him because Sid was excited because he'd never met a real psychologist at that point. And George explained to him what he did. And George said, well, I take people back into the past and we have them relive their traumatic experiences and then afterwards they then they complete their therapy. And Sid said, well, that sounds awful. And George's feelings were hurt, and he got defensive, and he said, well, I mean, it's what years of psychology have taught us to do with people. And Sid said, well, does it work? Do people get happier? And when George tells the story, he always kind of gets a little quiet at that point, and he says his heart sank because he realized that what he'd been doing up to that point didn't work. It was supposed to. It was by the book. It just didn't actually help people be happier. And he sort of struck out at Sid. And he said, well, what would you do to help people be happier? And Sid said, well, look, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not suggesting that what I say is the right thing. But I'd probably share what I'd seen in my life that helped me be happy and content and fulfilled. And George said his heart sank even further because he wasn't happy or content or fulfilled. And so for me, one of the beautiful things that I think you can do is just take a bit of time today to reflect on, well, what have you seen so far that makes you, if not happy and content, happier and more contented? And if you're not feeling happy and content now, what have you seen that in the moment of seeing it made it easier for you to really find the well-being within and live from it, if only for a little while? Have fun, learn heaps. If you got anything good, please share it in the comment section below, and I'll talk with you soon.